Welcome to Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America. This series explores the enduring presence of racism and the psychoanalytic mechanisms that sustain it, drawing inspiration from key works and current research. Hosts Dr. Karyne Messina and Dr. Felecia Powell-Williams explore the complexities of racism through the lens of psychoanalysis as they foster a crucial dialogue on racial inequality. Here are your hosts.
Hello, my name is Karyne Messina. I'm a psychologist, child, adolescent, and adult psychoanalyst, author, and a New Books Network podcast host. The books I write focus to a large extent on understanding how real-world events are affected by a defense mechanism Melanie Klein called projective identification. Beyond the consulting room, I think splitting, a frequent precursor to projective identification, affects many people, ranging from bullies on the playground to authoritarian leaders around the world, and a lot of other people in between. I believe this occurs when people separate other people into categories, what they call or what they consider the good people from the bad people, and thereafter project aspects of themselves that they can't tolerate onto unsuspecting people in the quote-unquote bad category. It is my quest in life to help people understand how pervasive this defense mechanism is and how it affects people everywhere in all walks of life, including cases of racism, domestic violence, misogyny, sexual assault, issues with bullies of all types, and in all kinds of situations where one person voices what they can't tolerate about themselves onto another, and then claims the other person is the one who has the feeling or the attributes or the characteristics the projector can't stand about himself or herself. With that introduction, I'd like to shift gears and let you get to know my co-host, Felecia Powell-Williams. Felecia, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your interest in doing this podcast, and then I'll explain the podcast and how it came about.
As Karyne has mentioned, I am co-hosting with her. I am a psychoanalyst here in the Houston, Texas area. I currently am a faculty member, and also a member of the board of the Center for Psychoanalytic Studies. And I co-chair the child program within our center as well. I provide clinical supervision. I'm considered a candidates analyst and consulting analyst, known more as TASA within the psychoanalytic community. Also, I'm a member of APSA, and currently I chair the diversity section within the DPE, which is the Department of Psychoanalytic Education. I'm a member of the ACP as well. That is the Association for Child Psychoanalysis, and I practice here in the Houston area. I've been practicing for approximately, Karyne, I think it's been somewhere between 15 plus years in Houston, and just really enjoy what I do and enjoy being able to share and provide contributions to our psychoanalytic community.
Well, that's extremely interesting, and I'm glad that you're telling our viewers so they'll get to know both of us. I also thought I would talk a little bit about how this podcast series emerged. After rewatching the documentary film Black Psychoanalysts Speak and reading the Holmes Commission Report, I approached Marshall Poe, the editor-in-chief of the New Books Network, and I inquired about developing another podcast to give white psychoanalysts an opportunity to hear about the experiences of Black psychoanalysts with regard to racism, microaggressions, and other forms of mistreatment, some of which occurred in psychoanalytic institutes. So the next step was waiting to hear from Marshall. And as it turns out, Marshall Poe was extremely enthusiastic and really endorsed the idea. He added that while he knew of podcasts that discuss racism in America, of course, I mean, there are this podcast, he said he was unaware of any that focused on the topic from a psychoanalytic perspective. I was very fortunate to have Dr. Felecia Powell-Williams join the effort and join the conversation. She's added a great deal of very important ideas about issues that we're going to talk about, and we hope will make this podcast series a meaningful resource for everyone who's interested in the topic. We will focus on racism and why it persists in America today, while considering psychoanalytic theories that can help provide insights about racial inequality, mechanisms of defense, such as projective identification, which I've mentioned already, denial, displacement, rationalization, suppression, and other defenses that affect Black members, candidates, instructors, and training and supervising analysts who are part of our institutes will also be considered. We will also talk about current events, relevant books and articles that further the discussion about racism and why it persists in America from a psychoanalytic vantage point. This particular series, this first series, will consist of several podcasts. So it's not just one. We'll do several over the next several months. And also, we'll be talking about books, one of which I think is still very meaningful, although it was written in the 60s. This is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? I think it's so vitally important because Dr. King had ideas that were very current in the 60s, and they're very current now. And if we had listened to him, we wouldn't have the divided America we have today. I really believe that.
Mm-hmm.
Why weren't his ideas considered? It'd be very interesting to hear. Felecia, maybe you have some thoughts about that. I'd love to know what you think about that.
You know, this particular book it had mixed reviews from many because, these reviews were filled with othering and various isms because Dr. King presented his thoughts and beliefs of unity, and that in order for there to be unity, that we had to come together and start thinking and thinking collaboratively, Karyne, and really start looking at how do we begin to mend many things? How do we begin to mend community? How do we begin to mend the economic system, especially with how there have been so many marginalized communities, disparaging situations within, especially the African American community. Then there's the other piece of looking at education, looking at employment. So he brought all of this together in his thoughts in this book. And as he's doing that, he's also writing about what must white America give up in order to bring this type of unity and community experience within the American culture. And it frightened many. And it was coming really off of the heels of the riots in Watts. And usually what happens when there's such a protest, as it was with the African American community there, you had many of the white citizens who were really struggling with trying to figure out how to understand this, and ended up somewhat joining in with those who were very racist about how these particular groups should exist. And so I think it was frightening because no one could really sit and understand, well, yeah, the African Americans should have a right, but what do we have to give up in order for that to happen? And might there not be a willingness to look at that and to look at really the experience that they were having. And Dr. King was like, hey, you don't know what the experience is until you walk in it. And that was loud in the book, but it also was a revelation for many who were frightened by just the thought and what he was bringing in that book.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. I have a question. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I think it's really important for me to listen and to learn from you and not to assume I know, because you can know about somebody else's experience from reading books. You have to live the experience.
That's right.
So I think it's incumbent on white psychoanalysts and anybody else to listen to the experience of Black people, not just to assume they have some kind of answer, because they can't. That's not possible. But in that regard, this is a question. One thing Dr. King said was that he didn't put it this way, but the way I interpret it is that the root of all this came down to money. That you could let somebody sit at a counter with you in a restaurant or a diner, or I guess back in the day there were counters in farm drugstores. You could do that. Maybe you gossip about it a little bit. Okay, so you do that. So you say, okay, well, Black people could use the same restroom. But when you face something like overhauling the country and going to your own pocketbooks to pay tax money to overcome poverty, that's a whole different ballgame.
That's right.
So for me, it came down to a large extent on money. I don't want to get money for this. So thought many people, or they might not have thought it, but unconsciously, that seems to be something that was in play.
Of course it was, but it's still in play, Karyne. The beauty of our discussion today, I'm a sidetrack and hopefully lead back into this thought of money, and looking at where do we go from here. The beauty of us talking about this today and any other day is significant. But today, on the anniversary of the death of George Floyd, and so as we're talking about, where do we go from here, as Dr. King presented to us, we're left with the painful reminder of when we don't listen to what's actually being experienced and what happens in the silence. And so there's all of the protest, and there became a willingness to listen to the pain and the torment and the unfairness and the marginalization that was occurring within these various communities, especially the African American community, upon George Floyd's death. And so as we talk about it, we're talking about, money. Dr. King asked, or he didn't ask, I would say he presented a thought for us to sit with. In order for there to be some sense of fairness, some room for growth and unity, the government would have to present something that would financially support these particular communities. And that was not met with agreement. It was not met with people wanting to embrace it. It was something that created concern of why would we give up for this group. So the othering began early on as he presented within his thoughts in this book. And it continues. It continues with how we look at various things, even within the psychoanalytic community, and how we look at our training, how we look at ways in which we recruit different races or communities or people of color. It's interesting because it does come down to how do we finance, how do we bring in the wealth of thought. And many times when we think about the wealth of thought, we tend to dismiss that there's such a beauty and wealth within every community, every culture, every ethnicity and race, and the importance of us being able to embrace that and look at that. But also with, looking at money, we have to look at ourselves. And so you have a population, and as Dr. King mentions in his book, White America, really having to look at themselves and look at the fact that there's something that's happening that continues to keep one from wanting to embrace that unity and bring things together, bring cultures and communities together. I really appreciate the work of the Holmes Commission. You mentioned that earlier in your introduction. And the work of the Holmes Commission, they really took their time so beautifully and eloquently with developing a report for many of us in the psychoanalytic community and even outside of that community to begin to think about, things such as this, such as recruitment, such as making sure that there are resources for people of color, for other groups who are interested in psychoanalytic thinking, but are oftentimes disregarded or not invited in. But then it wasn't necessarily just about race. We're looking at various layers of diversities that are not necessarily considered or had not been considered, as the APSA community is definitely looking at now, making sure that those are things that are on our minds and that are actively being done. But there was a time where it wasn't. And how they beautifully wove together this report with recommendations for many of us to begin to look at that and to address that. And they continue to do that work. And from that work, there have been many groups and task force and communities that are embracing this, societies and institutes that have embraced this to begin to look at it. And as Dr. King also talked about education, what are we doing with our curriculums? How are we educating our analysts? And so bringing in those diverse articles and books and things for us to begin to think about that has also been such a relevant factor in how we are growing and hopefully uniting within this community as well.
I think we need to keep the Holmes Commission in mind. I think we need to keep reviewing it over and over again, because it doesn't take much for someone to make a comment. This is just an example on the APSA listserv, and in any other place for that matter, to make people fall off the train, so to speak, and go back to their old ways of being defensive, of arguing, of old wounds. So there's progress, and then a comment is made, and then 40 people respond to it. Not necessarily that number, but sometimes. And it's discouraging in a way, because you think you take 3 steps forward, and yet the next thing you know, you've taken 3 steps back.
You got it, Karyne. You put your finger on it right there. And then to add to that, why are we so afraid of learning about each other and getting to know each other? I think that is a beautiful piece to really sit with, because there's something to be said about, recognizing what you imagine one group is requesting or needs or wants. But you can imagine that, but how do you get to know them?
Absolutely.
And this is a part of his work too. How do you get to know them? How do you walk? How do you understand their experience if you can't walk in their shoes?
You have to listen to the people. That's the only way I know.
Yeah.
I mean,
and be able to embrace differences.
Sure.
Yeah.
What do we do with patients who've been traumatized? We listen. We may do other interventions, but we also listen.
That's right. And allow others to teach us.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's okay if we don't know everything. I mean, who does?
Yeah.
Who really does?
Only
But
the people who think they do.
yeah, there are quite a few that think they do, but can we be vulnerable enough to allow ourselves to be in that space and to be taught by others who have different points of view, who have lived different experiences? And I think as a Black analyst, people have been interested in what I've experienced in my training as well as an analyst since I've graduated. But it's hard to imagine if you don't know. And you must be willing to make space to learn, because I want to hear about the experience of the other. I want to hear, perhaps why they may have felt marginalized, why they may have felt that they were overwhelmed by perhaps some dominant culture or individuals or population within their institute. I want to hear about that. I want to hear about how they were able to navigate their way through that. But I also want to hear and be able to learn from that and to share that and perhaps bring individuals in to think about that, which is, some of what the commission had recommended with their consultation liaison network. It's for people to come together. And I think that many of our centers and institutes are beginning to do that, but there's still many of us who are still wandering around, so to speak, and not quite sure. And this is my opinion. And I take that from just my own observations and things that I've heard. But we have to learn from each other. We have to get to a place where we feel comfortable, just wanting to sit with. But even, and I'm going to stop with this, Karyne, even if we're not comfortable, can we be uncomfortable with each other? Because some of the best spaces is when there is this feeling of discomfort and unsafety that can be explored, and what comes out of that is so beautiful as well.
That reminds me of a group and the work they do. Braver Angels. It was a group started by Bill Doherty. You might have heard of it. And I attended some of their workshops. They let me sit in on some of them, and they were very powerful. They had red state and blue state people who had very different ideas, and they do this all the time. It's really grown. Sit down at the table and listen to each other.
There you go.
And not rant, rave, or scream, or jump up and down, but they just listened. And it was so powerful. Did they end up agreeing? Did they end up changing party affiliations? Nobody declared that they were. But it reminds me of mentalization. They did listen to each other in an atmosphere of respect without pointing fingers and criticizing the other person for their viewpoints. That reminds me of the political divide as well. And one thing Dr. King said was that all of these questions remind us that there is a need for a radical restructuring of the architect of American society. For its very survival's sake, America must re-examine all presuppositions and release itself from many things for centuries that have been held sacred. For the evils of racism, from poverty, from militarism, it's just the old way doesn't work. It never really did. Our economy, he said, must become a person-centered rather than a property and profit-centered world. And goes back to the issue of money, but it doesn't just go back to the issue of money. We need to sit down and talk with each other and restructure the way, this hierarchical way we are in the world.
That's so true. He was, as we all say, he was so ahead of his time and so relevant in his messages. And the time that he took to sit down and to write this and to think about this, and I know there were many drafts of this, but you couldn't get around it, and we still can't get around, how important this is. And, just the amount of aggression that's woven into an unwillingness to think and to be with differences, and how in those moments that aggression really tends to manifest its way into these divisions, and it keeps everybody, and he writes about this in his book, it keeps everyone in these very segregated spaces.
Well, this is where I think projective identification comes in. I think,
Yes.
the wrap up on this, for this defense mechanism for me, is that white people thrust onto Black Americans things they don't like and can't tolerate about themselves, and then they blame Black people for these undesirable qualities. They also track the people that they blame to make sure they still have the qualities. This is in their minds, so they being freed up from them. Now, this is unconscious. It's not like anybody sets out to do this. I mean,
That's right.
Mean-spirited types who do, but a lot of people, they don't intend to do it, but they do it nevertheless. And that's what makes this so difficult, such a difficult thing to grapple with. But yet, it's so important. America is got a lot of problems, but we're in trouble. Who knows what's going to happen with the 2024 election?
It's very difficult times. It continues to lead us to a place, as you talk about with projective identification, and being, bombarded with so many different thoughts and views. And oftentimes, in being bombarded in that way, there are the tons of projections that are woven into that. And how do we eventually find ourselves identifying with the aggressor? And what does that, lead us into? And it continues a cycle that is so hard to stop. It continues, it just kind of reminds me of that wheel that keeps turning, and you just add more and more, and it turns faster and faster and faster. But once it stops, you're able to sit with and hopefully wonder, okay, where am I? How did I get here? What did I take in order to fuel this wheel, fuel the energy and the thought that kept going, that got me to this place? And so we have to really think about what's in that for us, because it can lead to some very dangerous situations and very painful and traumatic moments within every community. And Dr. King was bringing forth that message. Where do we go from here? What happens if we don't think about unity? What happens without unity is complete discord, chaos, protest, and it leads us to the primitive aggression that would have to really be sorted through, which I think we've been doing for quite a long time, trying to sort through a lot of these primitive pieces.
If you just think about chaos or community, the idea of community and the idea that it's been lost is so so I think that applies to 2024 just like it applied to 1965 and before. Is it going to be chaos? Is it going to be community? Or is it in between?
What are your thoughts about that? Chaos or community?
It seems to me we're moving down the road, or at least towards the road. I think we're really already there of chaos. there will be chaos there could be chaos depending on the outcome of the election, I believe. We've already experienced a lot of chaos with regard to an election, so it can be frightening.
How do we move into a depressive position? How can we see both parts and not just be locked into, this one part, this part object system where, it's just the aggression, it's just this, and there's nothing else that we can see. But if we could see truly that there is the chaos and there is the community, and how these two actually do exist. But what do we need to do in order to preserve the community, in order to allow and fertilize and water and let it grow? I think that's going to be a big piece for us. And that continues in the analytic process of this country. How can we see our parts instead of it being so narrowed down to where it's only this because it can't be that, or it's only this because it can't be that, but how it can be both. And as Dr. King said, bringing those together so we can learn from each other and be able to unite and to grow into a place that can be a useful, way for us to prepare for generations to come.
Yeah. If we can do it, I think part of the task is walking in the other person's shoes to try to understand their lives, not just ours.
Yeah. But that's so hard to do, though, Karyne.
Yeah. No, it's hard.
Yeah. Who wants to walk in someone's shoes? And especially within someone that's not considered, privileged.
Yeah.
Who wants to lose privilege to walk in a place or in the shoes of someone who's not? It's hard to give up.
It's hard to give up. But the way things are going, if we don't do something, if we don't restructure the foundation of America, I think it's crossed many people's minds that democracy as we know it isn't going to exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty startling statement if you think about it, but there's certainly a lot of people who are thinking, oh, it might not. I mean, it's a fragile experiment, as people say. It hasn't really existed. We think, well, yeah, we've always lived in a democracy of sorts. I don't think it's the same in the Black world as the white world, but given what happens in other countries, I think we have been in a democracy, but it's not that old. It's not like it's been around forever. And I think some people can assume that. Well, of course, we'll rebound and democracy will keep going. I don't know, maybe not. In other parts of the world, there's a trend towards alt-right thinking. So could that happen here?
Has it happened here? Yes.
Yeah.
And as a Black woman who's a psychoanalyst, I can also say, has it happened? Yes. Does it continue to happen? Yes. Is it possible that it will continue? Yeah. Okay. But how do we take the time to look at reasons why? And I think we could sit here and talk about reasons why. And some of them go exactly back to where we started. We have to be able to listen. We have to be able to, a willingness to learn. But again, until we can get to a place of feeling comfortable with our discomfort, feeling, safe enough to share our thoughts of unsafety, it's going to be hard to do. And also, can we, within the discomfort, can we, within our community of privilege, can we let go of that? Can we let go of some of the privilege in order to not only walk in the shoes, but be able to sit and experience with the person in thinking and listening what it's been like for them, and what is it like for the other to hold their experience and think about it themselves. Maybe you're not walking in it, but at least you could think about what that might be like, that you haven't even had the experience. So there's so many ways for us to look at this, and as we were talking about it earlier, to really mentalize, look at those parts and move from there.
I think a lot of progress could be made if we could do that. So we
Yes.
start. It would be a big start, even if we don't walk in the shoes, just listening to the other person's perspective, sincerely listening.
I remember my father saying, Felecia, you have to listen, because if you don't listen, you don't know where you're going. And so, the wisdom of my parents, I embrace and hold. But there's such a truth. We have to be able to listen so that we know where we're going, so that we're not moving blindly.
Right. I would like, if you don't mind, for you to finish on the last note, but I do, there's one more passage from Dr. King's book that I think is so important, and I would like to read it, and then you can have the last word.
Okay.
It has to do with truth. And I think because of social media, for one thing, but not just social media, but it's a major contributor. Truth is something that people don't always consider. But what he said in 1967 is the following. It is time for all of us to teach each other the truth, to tell each other the truth about who and what had brought the Negro to the condition of deprivation against which he struggles today. In human relations, the truth is hard to come by because most groups are deceived about themselves. I think that's an important phrase. Rationalization and incessant search for scapegoats are the psychological cataracts that blind us from our individual and collective sins. For the day has passed for bland euphemisms. He who lives with untruth lives in spiritual slavery.
Yes, yes.
It's still the bonus we receive from knowing the truth. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free.
Oh, how beautiful. And how true.
And how current.
It's a lived experience. The truth shall set you free. That should be woven within the fabric of every human being, in my belief. Yeah. Karyne, thank you for giving me the opportunity to comment to this quote, and thinking about Dr. King's work and his fight for equality. I think the truth, as he so speaks about it, is not so much about people doing more to find just equality, but, or let me say it this way, not so much about people finding more to do with empathy, because I think that we can always wonder and be curious about the other person's experience. We have to also be in a place to sit with the truth about what's going on inside of us, our personal truth. And as psychoanalysts, the work that we do is so important, because what we're doing is we're helping our patients to explore through various paths of conscious and unconscious thought what their truth is and what led them there.
Absolutely.
And so to sit with truth, but then also we have to expand this. As we look at racism and we look at othering, what is the truth behind what drives the toxicity of those pieces? Because it lies within us all. And we know that we began to see differences in human beings as early as, weeks and months after birth. But what gets planted within our awareness, and what I believe is that there is so much of what we carry as human beings that may not necessarily be our truth, but it could be the transgenerational transmission of various traumas and experiences that we carry that may have been the truth of others, that we ourselves don't realize if it belongs to us or where did it come from. And we have to continue to not only with our patients explore, or at least give them that opportunity in the consulting room, but we need to begin to do that within our own psychoanalytic communities.
Absolutely.
And what is our truth there? And so I stop with that. Do we allow the chaos of the transgenerational pieces that we hold to continue to manifest and grow into these very disruptive moments? Or do we stop and explore it even more so that we can really begin to harvest something within our community and for our generations of continued trainees and candidates and analysts to be able to go out to the masses and work, and not just in our consulting rooms, but even within our communities, to see what's out there and to be willing to have a diverse mind of how we can work, how we can be within this world to do the work that is so needed for so many. To me, that's truth.
Yeah. This has been a very rewarding experience for me to have this conversation with you and to listen to you. So I think it's going to be a great experience to do others. So as we've talked, we plan to do one podcast a month. That's the schedule for now, and we'll see how it goes.
That's it. We'll take the journey.
We'll take the journey. Well, thank you so much, and I hope our listeners will tune in to this podcast and others, and there's more to come.
Yes.
Thank you, Felecia.
Oh, I'm honored. Thank you, Karyne.